In a vast, silent room deep within the heart of the Galactic Council, a decision was being made. It was a decision that would ripple through the stars, though no one could have predicted just how much. The council members, from various species across the galaxy, gathered in a circle, their eyes focused on the floating hologram in the center of the room. It displayed a young woman, an alien princess named Soraya, who stood in a grand hall, her face stern and unyielding, a symbol of the proud empire she hailed from. Her people, the Xerics, were an ancient and powerful species known for their strength in advanced technologies. But there was one thing that set them apart from other empires in the galaxy, something they had always been proud of. The Xerics had an unquestionable belief in their superiority, especially when it came to their royal bloodline. The Xerics believed that their blood was sacred and pure, a symbol of power that could never be tainted by weakness. In their eyes was infertility, a curse that had long plagued their royal family. For centuries, Xeric's royal family had been trying to find a solution, but no scientist, no technology, no doctor could cure the curse that plagued their bloodline. The Xerics believed that the inability to bear children was the greatest disgrace that could befall anyone, let alone a princess. And so, when Soraya was born into the royal family, a sense of dread and despair swept over the empire. Different. She was beautiful, but she could never bear children. Her fate had already been sealed. She would be a forgotten princess, a ruler without a future. As Soraya grew, she felt the weight of her people's disappointment. Her empire, once filled with pride and glory, had now turned its back on her, seeing her only as a symbol of failure. Her own people whispered behind her back, calling her a barren princess. The whispers grew louder as she grew older, and soon Soraya became a shadow of herself, a mere figurehead in a palace that no longer cared for her. The Galactic Council, a body of various species and governments, had been watching the downfall of the Xerix Empire from afar. They had taken note of the suffering of the royal family, and they saw an opportunity to make a mockery of the Xerix. They saw Soraya as the perfect pawn, symbol of weakness and shame, something they could use to entertain themselves and remind the Xerix of their failure. It was a cruel joke, one they had long planned. And so, in a secret meeting, the Galactic Council came to a decision. They would send Soraya to Earth. It would be a gift, they called it, but everyone knew it was meant as an insult. Earth, a planet still considered primitive by galactic standards, would be the perfect place for the infertile princess. The council believed that humans, with their humble technologies and backward ways, would never be able to help her, would live out the rest of her days as a forgotten princess, just as her empire had hoped. The decision was made. Earth would receive Soraya, and the Galactic Council would sit back and watch as the joke unfolded. But what they didn't know was that their plan was about to backfire in a way they could never have anticipated. Soraya's arrival on Earth was not the grand, spectacular entrance that the Galactic Council had envisioned. There was no fanfare, no cheering crowds, no grand welcoming ceremonies. Instead, Soraya was transported in silence. Her transport ship landing in a small, quiet area on the outskirts of a human city. The humans had been given very little information about her. They were told only that she was a gift from the Galactic Council, a symbol of their goodwill, though they had been given no explanation as to why she was considered a gift in the first place. When the ship doors opened, Soraya stepped out, her regal attire flowing around her, her eyes scanning the strange world before her. She had expected Earth to be dirty and chaotic, filled with primitive creatures that could barely speak, let alone comprehend the complexity of the galaxy. But what she saw was nothing like she had imagined. The humans were not as backward as the Galactic Council had led her to believe. There were buildings that touched the sky, machines that moved on their own, and people who, despite their simplicity, seemed to carry a certain strength in their eyes. Soraya stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do or where to go. She had been sent here as a joke, and yet she could not shake the feeling that this planet held something different, something strange. She was soon greeted by a human man named Daniel, a mechanic who had been assigned to care for her. He was the one who would show her the ways of this strange world, though neither of them knew it at the time. Daniel would become her first real connection to humanity. At first, Daniel did not know what to expect. He had heard the rumors about the barren princess from the Xerix Empire, and he had expected her to be cold, aloof, and distant. But when he met her, he was taken aback by the vulnerability he saw in her eyes. Soraya was not the cold, distant princess he had imagined. She was a woman who had been broken by her people, a woman who carried the weight of her empire's disappointment. Daniel offered her his hand, not out of pity, but out of genuine respect. He spoke to her not as an inferior, but as an equal, showing her that humans, despite their imperfections, were capable of kindness and empathy. He showed her the city where he lived, introducing her to the simple joys of human life, the feeling of sunlight on her skin, the laughter of children, playing in the streets, and the comfort of a warm meal shared between strangers. Soraya was skeptical at first. She had been trained her entire life to believe that she was worthless, that her inability to bear children made her less than nothing. But Daniel's kindness, his quiet strength, slowly began to change her. She found herself opening up to him in ways she never thought possible. For the first time in her life, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to her existence than the curse that had been placed upon her. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, Soraya's life on Earth began to take shape. She still carried the heavy burden of her people's rejection, but she found herself slowly shedding the armor she had built around her heart. The humans, with all their flaws, had shown her a different kind of strength, one that came not from power or dominance, but from compassion and resilience. Soraya had been sent to Earth as a joke, a burden to be discarded. But as she walked through the streets of the human city, her steps felt lighter. The weight of her past was still there, but it was no longer all-consuming. She was learning that perhaps the joke wasn't on her after all. Perhaps the joke was on those who believed they could break her. Those who believed that Earth, of all places, could never help her heal. As she looked up at the stars above, Soraya couldn't help but wonder. What if there was more to her fate than she had been told? What if her story wasn't finished yet? Soraya woke up to the sound of birds singing outside the window. It was strange to her, this noise. Where she came from, silence was valued. Silence meant strength, control. But here on Earth, the sound of life seemed to be everywhere. It was peaceful in a way that unsettled her. For the first time in her life, Soraya didn't feel the need to hide behind her royal walls. On Earth, there were no eyes on her judging every move, no expectations of perfection. It was as if she could just ... be ... She stood up from the bed and looked out the window. The view of the city below her was like something out of a dream tall. Buildings of glass and steel, cars moving like ants along the streets, people going about their daily lives. None of them seemed to care that she was a princess or that she came from a distant galaxy. To them, she was just another person, another face in the crowd. It was a strange feeling. She had been royalty for as long as she could remember, but here, no one cared. For the first time in her life, Soraya felt ordinary, and somehow, that made her feel more alive than she had ever felt before. She took a deep breath and turned to face the room. It was simple, nothing like the grand halls of the Xerix Palace, but it was comfortable. There was a small table by the window, a chair, a simple bed, nothing extravagant. Nothing to remind her of the weight of her empire's expectations. The door opened quietly, and Daniel walked in. He had become a familiar face to her, someone she had come to trust in ways she never thought possible. He was just a mechanic, a human, but there was something about him that made her feel safe. It wasn't just his kindness, it was the way he looked at her. He didn't see a princess or a royal. He saw a person, just a person. And for Soraya, that made all the difference. "Good morning," Daniel said with a soft smile, holding a small tray with a cup of something warm. "I thought you might like some tea." Soraya nodded, though she didn't take the cup right away. Instead, she studied him, as she had begun to do more and more. He was tall, with broad shoulders and calloused hands from years of working with machines. His face was weathered, not in a way that made him look old, but in a way that spoke of someone who had lived a hard life and kept moving forward. There was no arrogance in him, no sense of superiority. He didn't care that she was a princess. To him, she was just another human, just another person in need. "Thank you," Soraya said quietly, her voice soft and unsure. She took the cup and sipped it slowly. The warmth spread through her, filling her with a comfort she hadn't realized. She needed. Daniel sat down at the small table across from her. "How are you feeling today?" he asked gently, his eyes studying her carefully. I don't know," she replied, her gaze dropping to the table. "Everything is different. Here, it's hard to explain." Daniel nodded, as if he understood. "It's a lot to take in, I imagine." Soraya didn't answer. She wasn't sure what to say. How could she explain the confusion inside her? On one hand, Earth felt like a sanctuary. The humans were kind, and Daniel had treated her with a level of respect she had never known before. But on the other hand, there was the nagging feeling that she didn't belong here. She was still the alien, the outsider. There was a part of her that still felt like she didn't deserve this peace, like she was living in someone else's world. "I've never felt this way before," Soraya said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've always been told what to do, how to act, what to think, but here I feel like I'm just existing." Daniel smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that mocked her or made her feel small. It was a smile of understanding. "Sometimes that's all we need," he said softly. "To just exist. To not have to be anything or anyone. Just to be." Soraya looked up at him then, her heart stirring in a way she hadn't expected. There was something in his words that touched her, something that made her feel understood. It was a strange feeling, one she wasn't used to. But it was also comforting. She took another sip of her tea, the warmth spreading through her body, and for a moment, she allowed herself to relax. She didn't have to be a princess here. She didn't have to be the symbol of an empire or a disappointment. She could just be herself. That was enough. The days passed slowly at first. Soraya spent her time getting to know Earth in small ways. She learned how to use the technology humans had developed, though it was often clumsy at first. The machines seemed so simple to them, but to Soraya, they were a mystery. She found herself fascinated by the small details, the way a car moved. Without any visible driver, strange devices people carried that allowed them to communicate across vast distances. The food, which tasted nothing like what she was used to, but was surprisingly good. Daniel took her on small trips around the city, showing her the sights. She marveled at the way the humans lived, their ability to create such beauty in a world that was, to her, still so young. The people here weren't like the cold, distant beings she had known in her own empire. They laughed, they argued, they worked together. There was something about their resilience that inspired her. But it wasn't just the people of Earth that she grew to appreciate. It was also the planet itself. There was something about the way the wind blew through the trees, or the way the sky changed colors at sunset, that made her feel connected to this place. Earth wasn't just a random planet. It was alive, in a way she had never understood until now. The air was thick with the scent of flowers. The ground was soft beneath her feet, and the ocean stretched out like an endless horizon. There was beauty in every corner of this world, and it made Soraya feel small in the best possible way. One day, while walking through a park with Daniel, she stopped at the edge of a small pond. The water was still, reflecting the blue sky above. She knelt down to get a closer look, watching a small fish swam just below the surface. "Earth is beautiful," she said softly, more to herself than to Daniel. "It is," he agreed, standing beside her. "It's not perfect, but that's what makes it so special." Soraya looked at him then, really looked at him. There was something in his eyes that made her heart ache, a warmth that made her feel both comforted and strange. She didn't understand it, not fully, but she felt drawn to him in a way she couldn't explain. He was human, and she was not. Yet in that moment, the difference didn't matter. For the first time in her life, Soraya felt like she wasn't alone. It was as if the weight of her past, the pain of her empire's rejection, had lifted just a little. She didn't have to be the perfect princess anymore. She didn't have to be the one to save her people. She could just be herself. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Soraya found herself growing stronger. It wasn't just her body that was healing, though she could feel the difference there too. It was her heart, the constant bitterness, the anger, the resentments, slowly, they began to fade away. The princess, who had once felt like a failure, was slowly becoming someone else, someone who could love, someone who could hope, and it was all because of Earth, because of the humans, because of Daniel. The sky above Earth was vast and endless, much like the journey Soraya was on. She had come to this planet as a joke-a-gift, they called it, but it was nothing more than a cruel reminder of her perceived failure. But now, with each passing day, she was beginning to see Earth in a new light. It wasn't just a place of exile. It wasn't just a prison, as she had initially feared. There was something here, something that made her feel alive again. Her days had become routine. She spent time with Daniel, learning more about the strange ways of the humans, observing how they interacted with one another and with the world around them. He had shown her how to use the simplest of human tools, from a hammer to a wrench. And even though she had once looked down on their primitive technology, she began to see beauty in it. There was an elegance in the way things worked here, even if they weren't as advanced as the technologies of her empire. But it wasn't just the machines that fascinated her. It was the people. The humans had a resilience she couldn't quite explain. They worked together, they laughed, they cried, and despite the many hardships they faced, they always seemed to find a way to move forward. Soraya found herself studying them, fascinated by how they managed to hold on to hope even when the odds were stacked against them. It was something her people, the Xerics, had long forgotten, the power of hope. As the days turned into weeks, Soraya found herself growing, more comfortable with her new life. She had become less focused on the past and more focused on the present. She no longer woke up every morning with the same crushing weight of failure. Instead, she woke up with a sense of possibility, a possibility that had once seemed so distant, so out of reach. But here on Earth, it felt within her grasp. She had started spending more time outdoors, walking through the human cities and fields, observing the way humans interacted with their world. Sometimes she would sit in the parks, watching families with their children, feeling an ache in her chest that she could not explain. For so long she had been told she was broken. She had been told that her inability to bear children was a curse, a flaw that made her unworthy of love or respect. But on Earth, she was beginning to see that perhaps the greatest gift wasn't in what you could give to others, but in what you could offer yourself. It was during one of these walks that something unexpected happened. Soraya was wandering through a quiet park, her feet carrying her aimlessly through the lush green grass. It was a beautiful day. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground, and the air was warm but not hot. There was a calmness to the world around her, and for the first time in her life, Soraya felt at peace. As she walked, her mind wandered back to her empire. She thought of the Xerix leaders, the ones who had abandoned her, who had cast her aside. Because of her infertility, she had been their symbol of failure, the proof that their bloodline was not as pure as they had believed. But now, in this moment, she began to feel something shift inside her. The pain of her past was still there, but it was no longer all-consuming. She could feel it starting to fade, replaced by something new, something she had never expected to find. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice calling her name. She turned around, surprised to see a small group of children running toward her. They were laughing, their faces bright with excitement, and one of them was holding something in their hands. "Princess Soraya," the little girl called out, her voice filled with joy. "We made something for you." Soraya was taken aback. She hadn't been called princess in so long, and the word felt foreign on her ears. But before she could respond, the girl handed her a small, handmade flower. It wasn't much, just a simple flower made from paper, with bright colors, drawn on it in crayon. But as Soraya looked at it, her heart swelled with an emotion she hadn't felt in years. The simple gesture, the innocence of the children, moved her in a way she couldn't explain. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. The children giggled and ran off, leaving her standing there with the flower in her hand. For a long moment, Soraya stood there, staring at the paper flower. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was sincere. It was the kind of kindness she had never expected to find on Earth. The kind of kindness that made her realize that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as broken as she had thought, as she walked back to Daniel's home that evening. Soraya couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her was changing. She had come to Earth thinking she was beyond help, beyond redemption. But now she felt different. She felt as though she had been given a second chance, a chance to heal and to grow. And as much as she hated to admit it, she had come to care for the humans in a way she hadn't anticipated. The next morning, Daniel took her to a small farm on the outskirts of the city. It was a place that was simple but beautiful, with rows of vegetables growing in neat rows and animals grazing in the fields. The farm was owned by a family who had taken Daniel in when he first arrived on Earth. They were kind, humble people who worked hard to make a living as they walked through the fields. Daniel explained the importance of farming on Earth. Humans rely on the land for food, for survival, he said. It's not easy, but it's something we all depend on. Soraya watched as Daniel spoke to the farmers, his hands moving with practiced ease as he helped them repair a fence. She had never seen this side of him before. She had always known him as the quiet mechanic, the one who had taken her in and treated her with kindness. But now, as she watched him work alongside the humans, she saw a different side of him, a side that was strong, capable, and deeply connected to the world around him. For the first time in a long while, Soraya found herself thinking about her own connection to the world. Her people had always been obsessed with power, with dominance. They had forgotten the importance of the earth beneath their feet, the importance of the simple things. They had looked down on the humans, believing they were weak, primitive. But now, as Soraya stood there, she saw the truth. The humans weren't weak. They were strong in ways her people had never understood. The days continued to pass, and Soraya's bond with the humans grew stronger. She found herself talking more and more with Daniel, sharing her thoughts and fears. She realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't hiding behind a mask of royalty. She was simply Soraya, a woman who had been given a second chance. A woman who was learning to live. But there was still one thing that weighed heavily on her heart. She had come to Earth thinking that she would never be able to bear children. She had been told by the best doctors of her empire that it was impossible, and yet over time she began to feel something inside her that she couldn't explain. There was a strange feeling in her chest, a sensation that she had never experienced before. It was as if her body, which had once been barren, was beginning to stir with life. At first, Soraya thought it was just her imagination, but as the days passed, she couldn't shake the feeling. It was subtle at first, just a faint sensation, like a flutter in her chest. But then it grew stronger, and she realized with a shock that something was changing. She was changing. One evening, after a long day spent working in the fields with Daniel, Soraya stood by the window in her small room, staring out at the stars, and the feeling inside her was stronger now, and she couldn't deny it any longer. Could it be that Caesarea, the barren princess, was pregnant? The thought was almost too much for her to bear. She had never believed it was possible. But now, as she felt the life growing inside her, she couldn't help but wonder, was it a miracle? Or was it simply the result of something greater? Something that could not be explained by science or reason? For the first time in her life, Soraya felt hope.
Our true hope.
Soraya had always prided herself on knowing the truth. As a princess of the Xerics, she had been taught from a young age to trust in the facts, to believe in the knowledge passed down through generations. One of those truths, one of the most undeniable facts, had always been that she could never bear children. The medical scans, the countless tests, all the advanced science of her people had told her the same thing. It was impossible. But now, with each passing day, Soraya felt something that went against everything she had been taught. She had always thought that her body was broken, that she was useless in the eyes of her people because of her infertility. She had accepted that fact, as painful as it was. But here, on Earth, far from the eyes of the Xerics, something was happening to her. Her body was changing in ways she didn't understand, and at first she had dismissed it as nothing more than a trick of her mind. But now, she couldn't ignore it any longer. For days, Soraya kept the secret to herself. She didn't know what to do or who to turn to. Daniel, the human who had become her closest friend, had treated her with nothing but kindness, and she had begun to care for him in ways she had never expected. But this was something she wasn't sure she could share. How could she explain what was happening to her? How could she tell him that the one thing she had been told was impossible? The one thing that had always defined her as broken might actually be happening? The first sign had come in the form of a strange feeling deep within her, something she had never experienced before. It wasn't painful, but it was different. It was a fluttering sensation, like a tiny heartbeat, a pulse, that came from somewhere inside her. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, a lingering thought that had no basis in reality. But as the days passed, the feeling became stronger. It was as if something was stirring within her. One morning, as Soraya sat by the window, watching the sun rise over the horizon, she felt it again, fluttering. It was undeniable now. She placed a hand on her stomach, her breath catching in her throat. Was this really happening? Was she truly pregnant? The thought overwhelmed her. How could it be possible? She had been told by her own people, the most advanced medical minds in the galaxy, that she was incapable of having children. Her bloodline was cursed, they had said. Her body had failed her. And yet here she was, feeling the life within her grow stronger by the day. Soraya stood up from the window, her mind racing. She walked slowly through the small room, her feet carrying her without thought. The feeling inside her was growing stronger, more real. She stopped in front of a mirror, staring at her reflection, as if she could find some answer there. All she saw was herself, the same woman who had arrived on Earth broken and alone. And yet, something had changed. Something deep inside her had shifted. She was no longer the infertile princess, cast aside by her people. She was something else now. But could she be sure? Was this just a dream, a fantasy her mind had created to ease the pain of her past? She didn't know. She couldn't be certain. But the fluttering inside her, the small, gentle pulse that had become more frequent with each passing day, told her that this was real. And for the first time in her life, Soraya allowed herself to believe in something more than the cold, hard truths she had been taught. She couldn't keep this to herself anymore. She had to tell Daniel. He was the only person she trusted, the only one who had shown her kindness when she had expected none. He had always been there for her, treating her with respect and understanding. If anyone could help her make sense of this, it was him. Later that afternoon, Soraya found Daniel working in the small garden behind the house. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the earth. He was kneeling on the ground, his hands covered in soil as he worked to plant a row of seeds. Soraya stood for a moment, watching him in silence, unsure of how to begin. "Daniel," she called softly. He looked up, his face breaking into a smile when he saw her. "Hey, Soraya, what's going?" Soraya took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Daniel stood up and dusted off his hands, his expression turning serious. "What is it? You can tell me anything." Soraya walked slowly toward him, her gaze focused on the ground. "I don't know what's happening to me," she said quietly, "but I think I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them, a heavy silence settling over the moment. Daniel's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Soraya felt her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of her confession hanging over her like a cloud. "Are you sure?" Daniel asked finally, his voice gentle. Soraya nodded slowly. "I didn't believe it at first. I thought it was just my imagination, but the feeling, it's real. I can feel it inside me." Daniel stepped closer to her, his hand reaching out to gently touch her arm. "This is incredible," he said, his voice filled with awe. Soraya looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any hint of doubt or disbelief. But all she saw was amazement. There was no judgment in his eyes, no confusion, just a quiet understanding. "I never thought this could happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been told my whole life that I couldn't have children, that I was broken, that I was cursed." Daniel shook his head. "You're not broken, Soraya. You never were." Soraya swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in her throat. She had always believed she was a failure. Her empire had believed it too. It had cast her aside because of her infertility, treating her as though she were worthless. But here, in Daniel's eyes, she saw something else. Something she had never seen before? Acceptance. This isn't possible," she continued, her voice filled with uncertainty. "The doctors from my empire told me it was impossible. I was never supposed to be able to bear children." Daniel took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. "You're not broken, Soraya. Whatever the universe has in store for you, you have the strength to handle it." The warmth of his touch, the sincerity in his words, made something inside her shift. For the first time in her life, Soraya allowed herself to hope. She had spent so many years believing that her inability to have children defined her, that it was the one thing that made her unworthy of love, of respect. But now, with Daniel by her side, she felt something different. Not something she hadn't felt before.
That sense of possibility.
A sense that maybe, just maybe, this miracle was meant to happen. "I don't know what to do," Soraya said, her voice trembling. Daniel smiled softly. "You don't have to do anything, Soraya. Just take it one day at a time. We'll figure this out together." In that moment, Soraya realized something that she had never understood before. It wasn't the absence of children that made her valuable. It wasn't the things she couldn't do that defined her. It was the strength she had inside her, the strength that had carried her through so much pain and suffering. And now, as she looked at Daniel, she realized that she wasn't alone anymore. For the first time, she had someone who believed in her, someone who saw her for who she truly was. Soraya had never felt so torn in her life. The news of her pregnancy, once something she could hardly believe, had become her reality. It was a truth she could no longer ignore, a truth that had brought both hope and fear into her heart. Could feel the tiny life growing inside her, the miracle that defied all the odds, and yet she still had so many questions. What did this mean for her future? What would her people think if they knew? It had been weeks since she had shared her secret with Daniel. Since then, the two of them had been preparing for a future that neither of them fully understood. While Earth had become a place of refuge for Soraya, a place where she had begun to heal and feel valued again, there was still a part of her that was unsure. The world she had come from, the Xerix Empire, was a place where strength and bloodlines mattered more than anything else. If they learned of her pregnancy, what would they say? Would they see her as a symbol of hope, or would they cast her aside once again as a failure? Despite her doubts, Soraya had come to a decision. She couldn't hide from her past forever. She couldn't stay on Earth, away from her people, pretending that nothing had happened. The child growing inside her was part of both worlds, the human world she had come to cherish and the Xerix Empire she had left behind. If she was going to raise this child, she needed to understand what it meant for her and for the future of her people. One morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, Soraya turned to Daniel, who was sitting beside her on the porch. His hand rested gently on her back, his touch a constant comfort in the whirlwind of emotions that had become her life. "I have to go back," Soraya said softly, her voice thick with uncertainty. Daniel looked at her, his expression filled with concern. "Go back where?" "Back to my people. To the Xerix Empire," she explained. "I need to face them, to tell them what has happened." Daniel's face darkened with worry. "Are you sure about this? After everything that's happened? After everything they did to you?" Soraya nodded slowly. "I don't know what I'll find there, Daniel. I don't know how they'll react, but I can't keep running from my past, and I can't raise this child in hiding." Daniel remained silent for a long time, his hand still resting on her back. The weight of her words hung in the air, and he could feel the conflict inside her. He had seen how much Soraya had changed since arriving on Earth. She had begun to heal, to find a sense of peace she had never known before. But now she was returning to a world that had rejected her, world that had never understood her. He wasn't sure she was ready to face it again. Finally he spoke, his voice soft but firm. "I'll go with you." Soraya's eyes widened. What? You don't have to do that. This is something I need to do on my own. I know you think you need to do this alone, Daniel said, his voice gentle. But you don't have to face this by yourself. You've already shown me how strong you are, Soraya. And now it's my turn to show you that you don't have to do everything alone. The sincerity in his words touched her deeply. For a moment she was speechless. She had never expected this from him, had never expected anyone to stand by her. Way Daniel was, Net. Here he was, offering her not just his support, but his presence, his loyalty. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Daniel replied, smiling warmly. I'm with you, no matter what. The next few days were spent preparing for their journey. Soraya had spent most of her life on the move, traveling from one royal palace to another, living in the shadows of her empire's power. But this was different. This was not a trip she was making for political reasons or to fulfill a royal duty. This was a journey of self-discovery, a journey back to a place she had once called home, but had never truly belonged. When the day came to leave, Soraya stood at the edge of the human city, looking out over the skyline, feeling a mix of fear and excitement. Earth had become her sanctuary, the place where she had learned to trust again, to believe in herself. But now she was leaving it. Behind Daniel stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. Are you ready? He asked. Soraya took a deep breath and nodded. I'm ready. The journey back to the Xarix Empire was long, and the closer they got, the more Soraya felt the weight of her decision pressing on her. She had lived so long in the shadows of her people's expectations, so long believing that she was nothing. More than a symbol of failure, what would it mean to return now with a child growing inside her, when her empire had never valued her for anything other than her bloodline? As they neared the homeworld of the Xarix, the atmosphere around them began to shift. The sleek, metallic ships that once represented power and dominance seemed so distant now. Soraya felt as though she were a different person, someone who had seen the world in a new light. She no longer saw the Empire as a place of glory and strength. Now she saw it for what it was, an empire built on pride, built on a belief that blood and power were the only things that mattered. The ship finally landed on the surface of the Xarix homeworld. Soraya stepped out, her feet touching the ground of the planet she had once known as home. The air was thick, the sky a deep shade. Of red, it was as if the world itself had changed in her absence. She looked around, taking in the familiar sights, the towering buildings, the vast spaceships in the distance, the crowds of people who seemed to walk with a sense of purpose and superiority. And then she saw them, the leaders of the Xarix Empire. They stood at the edge of the landing area, their eyes fixed on her with a mix of curiosity and disdain. They had never forgiven her for her infertility. They had cast her aside as if she were nothing more than a failure, a disappointment to their great empire. Soraya, one of the leaders, said coldly, her voice sharp as a blade. You return at last. I trust you've come to accept your place in our world. Soraya stood tall, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading. But she would not be cowed. She would not let them define her any longer. I've come back for a reason, Soraya said, her voice steady, but firm. I'm here to show you that I'm not the failure you believed me to be. I'm here to show you that there is more to strength than bloodlines and power. The leader's eyes narrowed. What could you possibly have to show us? Soraya took a deep breath, feeling the life inside her stirring. She placed a hand on her stomach, the first time she had done so in front of anyone on this planet. This, she said, her voice steady, this child is proof that I am not what you made me out to be. And this child is proof that there is more to life than power. The leaders exchanged uneasy glances, their faces betraying the surprise they felt. It was a moment Soraya would never forget, the moment when her empire saw her not as a disappointment, but as a woman who had the power to defy the odds. For the first time in her life, Soraya felt as though she had finally found her place in the universe. She was not a symbol of failure. She was a mother. And no matter what the Xarix thought of her, no matter what they said, she would stand by her child and show them all the true meaning of strength.